All right. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here. I'm Shannon Moore, this is More Up North, and I'm very happy to say it's I think our 23rd episode. And we decided tonight that we would take some voices from the sound, basically. People that responded to the Exxon Valdez spill, who lived through it, and for the 21 years since. And to come together and talk about exactly what our best advice is for the Gulf of Mexico and the BP spill there. So you'll want to stay tuned and enjoy. Thank you guys so much for being here for More Up North. This is a difficult show to do. We bumped out. Well, I guess we should just say we deported the immigration show and decided that what we do is sort of an Alaskan response to the oil spill that's happened in the Gulf. And Hollis French is here, which I'm really glad.
Nice.
Senator Hollis French.
Always a pleasure. Nice to see you, Shannon, and your crowd.
And when my crowd, my
your
posse,
people. That's
my
right,
posse.
your people. Right.
That's right. And they're mean and they vote.
They seem restless. They seem restless tonight.
And then they vote, and then they call you and say, "I voted for you. What the hell are you doing?"
Right.
Exactly. So. The response has been really interesting here in Alaska, coming from our contingency that's back east, and also from the governor. And I know that you actually came out this week, you and Donnie Olson, and had actually put into writing a request of the governor, and wanted to talk to you about that.
Yeah, we did. You know, the issue is about coastal zone management, which is sort of a big word for something that boils down to local control. It's something that the federal government began in 1972. The state of Alaska adopted it formally in 1977, which really gives each local community some input into development that takes place there. And you know, this was in place and was in place strongly all through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, until onto the scene comes Governor Frank Murkowski. And he decided it was his mission in life to stop coastal zone management. They gutted the program in 2003, and it's been gutted ever since. Senator Donnie Olson and other folks introduced a bill last year to reestablish a strong coastal zone management program, and it almost got through the legislature until it hit a brick wall in the Parnell administration at the end of the session. And there was sort of a throwdown, to use a technical term, from the oil industry. It was like, no, we're stopping this at all costs. Mayor Itta from the North Slope flew to Juneau, was rebuffed, couldn't get a meeting with the governor the first time. You know, the governor rethought that, I think, under intense pressure, sat down with Mayor Itta, and yet they wouldn't relent on their opposition. The bill died, and then the next day the spill begins. And frankly, you know, as Senator Olson and I looked at what had happened in the Gulf of Mexico and the problems they've had down there with sort of the lack of oversight over the plans of development, the lack of oversight over, you know, BP's minimizing the fact that there could be a catastrophic event there, we thought, you know, this is maybe a chance, a teaching moment for the governor to rethink his opposition to this, right, and to be more progressive about it when the next session begins. So we sort of launched a little arrow at him and said, look, you know, let's think now that we have this catastrophe on their hands before we have one on ours.
Well, you would have thought that the Exxon Valdez would have been a message to everyone else, and how funny we've forgotten those lessons, and now we need to take lessons from BP's spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm looking at this, and from what I'm understanding about this management, the coastal zone management, basically it would allow communities.
The North Slope Borough,
right,
you know, the city of Dillingham, you know, whatever tribal council there may be, to provide input. It's not, you know, think of the development that took place on the North Slope in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That all happened under a strong coastal zone management program. So please don't tell me that it will stop development. It just puts another set of eyes there, which is exactly what you want. You want every Alaskan thinking deeply about what's going on in their community before it happens, and give them a chance to speak on it and be heard.
Well, when we're looking at the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas, both being opened up for offshore drilling, the same sort of drilling that we're seeing an accident from, or a negligence from in the Gulf. You know, if we had that, in the Chukchi or the Beaufort Sea, there's ice on the top. And so I'm wondering if an oil spill happens and there's ice on top of it and no one there to clean it up, does it really happen?
You know, it's I worked for Shell Oil Company in Cook Inlet when I began my career in the oil industry back in 1979. And
God, you're old.
I was young. I was a baby. I really was. I was 20 years old, and I went out there and I started washing pots and pans, and I got promoted to roustabout. Big deal. I get to paint now and chip paint. And then I became a utility man and a production operator, and eventually went to the North Slope. But while I worked for Shell, they were doing exploratory work in the Beaufort Sea, and we went up there to do broken ice spill cleanup exercises. And they gave me one of those huge, remember those old video cameras were like that big?
Right.
I got a photograph of me holding one of those things like this.
Suitcase.
It's totally like a suitcase, you know. And they you know, dumped a little bit of oil in this broken ice and like threw a flare down on it, and the flare went out. And they tried this other, you know, I mean, they tried like 6 different ways to clean it up, and they have to get into the water in like frogman suits and shovel it into buckets and haul it out. That's how they cleaned up broken ice spill conditions in 1983. And I don't think they've come much farther in their technology since
Well,
then.
shouldn't we have a plan in place for a disaster before we create a disaster? Because that seems to be not the order that things are happening.
You know, and it's just so clear in retrospect what you need to do, and it's so hard to plan and make it happen looking forward. And that's why, you know, I'm glad you're having the show and people are thinking about it deeply, because, you know, an oil spill in that water kills the people of Barrow, of Wainwright, of Point Lay. They have lived on the marine mammals in that water for 5,000 years. That's their food security. You know, it's their bottom line. It's like the way I look at Costco, right? It's like, where do you go when everything's, you know, going to hell? Run to Costco and loot it for, you know, 100 pounds of rice. They look offshore and say, you know, who is going to...
The whales are in.
Right, who's going to... Right, and it's a happy day. It's a celebration day. And if those whales don't come in, that community dies. And so you don't have the chance to make more than one mistake. You can't have any. And so it's vitally important that local communities at least feel like they're participating in the decisions that affect them more than anybody else.
Well, I think that we absolutely should have that, and it's not surprising to me that this administration seems to ignore that. How do you address quickly the whole idea that if you want protections in development, that you're anti-development?
You know, that won't sell with me
you and
personally.
I both hear that often.
Right, you do. You know, I worked 12 years in the oil industry. I am an oil person. You know, we are an oil state. Don't kid yourself. But that doesn't mean you have to be lax. That doesn't mean you have to give it away. It's a resource you want to hand off to the next generation, both that oil resource and the environmental resources that surround it. And you just have to be hard-headed about that when you're dealing with an industry who pays deep, deep attention to the bottom line and not to, you know, sort of the holistic aspects of its developments.
Well, my whole thing is that corporations have one job, and that's to make money, to give their shareholders. That's their one job. Government has a different job, and it shouldn't be to make money for corporations.
Exactly.
It should be to protect us.
There are many areas where sort of our little work and their work overlap, but there are vast areas where they do not. And someone has to stand as a regulator, and the regulator is like a cop. And you want a hard-headed individual as your police officer, you know, looking after what's going on in your backyard.
I know. I'd like to say to the oil companies, "You're not the boss of me." So anyway, thank you.
Another way of saying it is they're the tenant and we're the landlord.
I like that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming
Always
in.
a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and have a great show.
All right.
Go team.
We'll do it. All right. We'll be right back with more Up North.